Once the lecture ends, we'll move on to a small Q&A, which should last around 15 to 20 minutes. Now, to ask a question, you have two possibilities. Either at any point in the webinar, you can ask a question in the Q&A function in the bottom bar. So it's not the chat, that's the Q&A point. You'll be able to write your question there and it'll be recorded. And you can also choose to upvote other people's questions so as to see which ones are the most popular. That's one way of asking a question. The second way of asking a question will be to ask a live question. So after the event ends, I'll first ask, does anybody want to ask a question live? You can raise your virtual hand. I'm sure everybody knows how to do that. I'll call on you. You can unmute yourself and you can ask the question. Once that is done, we'll move on to the questions in the Q&A. Moving on to the event, we're very lucky to have Professor Nasehi with us from the UCL Department of Economics, who's very kindly accepted to introduce our guest speaker. Without further ado, to you, Professor Nasehi.
Hi, everyone. Thanks to the Economist Society for putting together such an amazing conference. I'm Ramin, a lecturer in UCL Economics and also a member of CTAL, Center for Teaching and Learning Economics. As an academic, it's not every day that you get a chance to introduce a towering figure in the world of policymaking. So Dr. Ottmar Issing is one of Europe's most influential monetary policymakers of the last 20 years. I go further and say he has shaped the very landscape of European central banking that we have with us today. He has had a long experience of policymaking at Deutsche Bundesbank and the European Central Bank, and he has also advised various well-known private investment banks such as Goldman Sachs. His academic publications cover a vast area of policy issues, but most notably monetary policy theory and international economic relations. He has also been the author of various policy reports. He has headed various policy commissions. He's now the president of the Center of Financial Studies at Kothary University. Now, let me end by making a very brief comment on his impressive legacy. Dr. Issing has played a major role in establishing the credibility of European Central Bank as a successful institution focused on maintaining price stability. As the first chief economist of ECB, he developed a monetary policy decision approach, the two-pillar approach, which still guides policymaking in ECB today. To quote the president of Bundesbank, to this day, the Bundesbank and the ECB are reaping the benefits of his legacy. Without further ado, the floor is yours, Dr. Issing.
Thank you for this very, very kind introduction. Good evening to all of you. When I was asked to join the Deutsche Bundesbank, I hesitated to leave academia and become a central banker. Teaching, exchange with ever new groups of young students had been a major element of my professional life for 25 years or 50 semesters. So I was very disappointed when the pandemic prevented a personal meeting with you. So let us make the best out of this video conference, and I'm already looking forward to your questions. Considering that today almost all major central banks are given some independence, the title of my presentation, Can Central Bank Independence Survive?, seems a bit odd. However, historically, central bank independence was anything but the norm. There are important reasons why central banks were not independent. Firstly, and above all, the independence of the central bank seems to contradict core principles of democracy. A critic in Germany, for example, questioned, I quote, "All power within the state comes from the people, except that of the Deutsche Bundesbank." should competence for such an important task as setting interest rates for the whole economy be given to unelected technocrats? I refer to the book by Paul Tucker, former Vice Governor of the Bank of England. Secondly, for a long time, most economists were not in favor of independence for the central bank. It is interesting to note that this position was taken by two camps that otherwise had little in common. On the one hand, there were economists like James Tobin, who argued that the most efficient coordination between monetary and fiscal policy could be achieved by having the central bank act as part of the government. On the other side of the spectrum was a group of liberal, in the European sense, economists like Milton Friedman and Karl Brunner. They argued, in the tradition of Herbert Simon's 1936 Rules versus Authorities, that discretionary monetary policy decisions should not be handed over to central bankers who, in many cases, had demonstrated severe incompetence. Overall, for a long time, central bank independence was not treated as a major issue. There was hardly any relevant international discussion. You are a bit ahead with the slides. Okay. That's okay. One last slide back. Yeah. Against this background, it seems surprising that around 1990, so many countries decided to endow their central banks with the status of independence. Two reasons for this change of mind can be identified. The great inflation in the US in the 1970s triggered, after a significant time lag, a number of studies explaining the institutional background of this development. In the end, innumerable publications have delivered empirical evidence. There is a strong negative correlation between the degree of central bank independence and inflation. As it happened, this consensus emerged at a time when Europeans were preparing the introduction of the common currency, the euro, and discussing the statute of the future European Central Bank. Here, the example of the Deutsche Bundesbank, the only truly independent central bank in Europe at the time, played an important, if not decisive role. The D-Mark, alongside the Swiss franc, had been the most stable currency in the world, and Germany had also escaped the great inflation. It is no wonder that the German government insisted on the status of independence for the future European Central Bank. All other countries aiming to participate in European Monetary Union had to accept this position, more or less reluctantly, at a time when their own national central banks were not independent. There's the example of then President of France, François Mitterrand, who made a public statement that it would be an illusion to see that independent non-elected technocrats would decide on monetary policy issues. He insisted that they had just to follow the decisions by the heads of state and government. This remark was made shortly after he had signed the Maastricht Treaty, in which the independence for the European Central Bank is enshrined. The United Kingdom was a latecomer in this respect, waiting until May 1997 to give its central bank the status of independence. Chancellor Gordon Brown's statement, it encapsulates the change of mind of politicians in many countries. I quote, "The previous arrangements for monetary policy were too short-termist, encouraging short but unstable booms and higher inflation, followed inevitably by recession. This is why we promised in our election manifesto to reform the Bank of England to ensure that decision-making on monetary policy is more effective, open, accountable, and free from short-term political manipulation. End of quote. The consensus that had emerged can be summarized as follows. Central bank independence in a democracy can be constitutionally legalized. Second, central bank independence is a prerequisite for a stable currency. And third, has to be restricted to a clear and limited mandate. Now, please, next slide. Next slide, please. Late Bank of England, latecomer, we had already that, so yeah, this is okay. In the decade following the victory, so to say, of independence, the world enjoyed the period of the great moderation. Inflation came down from rather high levels and remained stable, and output volatility declined with rather good results for growth and employment. Growth and employment were at least satisfactory, while variability of output substantially declined. This period considerably enhanced the reputation of central banks and their leaders. It was almost unavoidable that, as a consequence, expectations regarding the ability of central banks to control the economy reached an unprecedented and unsustainable peak. This prestige was further heightened during the financial crisis, when central banks were perceived as having saved the world from a repeat of the Great Depression of the 1930s. Disappointment with politics in general and a loss of trust in politicians have also contributed to heightened public expectations of central banks. Central banks were not known for warning against such elevated expectations. Indeed, central bankers seemed to rather enjoy this high status. Think of the title, the Maestro for Alan Greenspan. At that time, head, so to say, of central bankers in the world. Indeed, central bankers seem to rather enjoy this high status. On top of this already fragile position came new obligations. Central banks have been made responsible for macroeconomic and microeconomic surveillance and control. As if overburdening from the sources explained above and the ensuing risk for their reputation were not enough, central banks continue to assume further responsibilities. This will be shown for the Fed and the ECB. In this context, I have also to point to the fact that we have to distinguish between de jure and de facto independence. De jure means that the status of the central bank endows the bank with the status of independence. In the case of the European Central Bank, this independence is enshrined in an international treaty which can be changed only by unanimity. This is, so to say, the highest degree of legal enforcement of the independence of the European Central Bank. By de facto independence, we mean that the central bank, the central bankers, exploit this independence to deliver a monetary policy which is concentrated on their main tasks to safeguard price stability, and in the case of the Fed, also high level of employment. And these two characters of independence come more and more under conflict. Unavoidably, monetary policy has an impact on the distribution of income and wealth. These implicit consequences are a clear departure from a concept in which a central bank takes decisions targeted at specific sectors or groups in society, for example, by giving credit at special conditions, as in the US has happened in the past, to students, specific sectors or companies. Such preferential actions are highly political and that must be reserved to policymakers who are ultimately responsible to their voters. I've also to mention that the extension of quantitative easing with huge amounts, purchases of government bonds by the central bank, blur the border between fiscal and monetary policy. So de facto independence is put in question. Coming back now on the next slide, please. The ECB, I have mentioned the Bank of England too. Next slide. One slide back. Coming back to the Fed, I have to quote James Powell, in a speech mentioned that as a consequence also of the Fed's expansionary policy, the gains, I quote, began to share more widely across society. The Black and Hispanic unemployment rates reached record lows, and the differentials between these rates and the white unemployment rate narrowed to their lowest levels on record. So implicitly, the Fed seems to have accepted a responsibility, which raises a number of questions. Can the process of the economy running hot always be stopped before inflation gets out of control? How should a conflict with the goal of price stability be resolved? And above all, once the Fed has to tighten monetary policy, those groups mentioned will be the first to lose their jobs. This was an unavoidable effect in the past when monetary policy in the end triggered a recession. However, the explicit acceptance of responsibility for distribution will place an additional pressure on the central bank. In any case, it will be exposed to a political debate that will go beyond what we have experienced up to now. And the central bank's independence will come under strong attack. Moving now to the ECB. The summer of 2021, the ECB published the result of its strategy review. In October 1998, I had presented to the Governing Council a proposal for a strategy how to conduct monetary policy, and as it was mentioned in the introduction, after so many years, this was now the first overall review, the one conducted in 2003 under my leadership, brought no major change. So in this summer, following the Fed, with a time lag of roughly a year, the EC published the results of a new encompassing strategy review. And a major change, I cannot discuss other issues of the review. I would be happy to answer questions on this, but here I will concentrate on one aspect. A major change is the inclusion of challenges stemming from climate change. Accordingly, the Council has published an ambitious action plan to deliver on this commitment. The reference to the specified climate change problem raises a number of questions. Climate change and corresponding government policies in response to it can have powerful effects on economic development. These consequences are reflected in all kinds of variables, growth, inflation, employment, that will in turn affect forecasts and in this way influence monetary policy decisions. Identifying the impact of climate change brings a major challenge in terms of adapting existing models and developing new ones. Research in this field and the intention to develop relevant statistical data and indicators to assess factors such as the carbon footprint of financial institutions alongside the work on modeling will require huge efforts. Even at a central bank, resources are not unlimited, and existing competencies are probably far away from the scientific fields which are at the core of projecting and addressing climate change and of assessing complete carbon footprints of individual private or public sectors. Including aspects of climate change in the economic as well as monetary and financial analysis is a complex task, and it remains open to what extent this might affect monetary policy decisions. By contrast, indirect implications of climate change's direct consequences follow from the adoption of the design of its monetary policy operational framework in relation to disclosures, risk assessment, corporate sector assets purchases, and the collateral framework. Here's not the place to go into details. The basic underlying idea is to form an in-house of central bank judgment on the value of assets that incorporates climate risks and regulatory requirements disclosures. The climate policy adjusted price or risk of an asset will then be the basis for actions by the ECB, from eligibility as collateral to corporate sector asset purchases. To call this a tremendous challenge is still an euphemism. Financial markets will price in developments for companies stemming from factors such as the foreseeable end of burning coal. But this is a very simple case. Think about the long production process in the chemical industry with all the footprints which are distributed all over the world to regions in which transparency on climate problems is scarce, to say it very modestly. Climate change, we all agree, I think, is probably the biggest challenge of our time. Central banks cannot ignore this and must not be seen as being blind to these risks. At the same time, confronting climate change is above all the responsibility of governments that are accountable to their parliaments and ultimately to their voters. Central banks are not made independent so that they can go beyond their mandate or actively correct decisions by parliaments. And with their climate-oriented actions, they should not deliver arguments that stronger measures by governments are unnecessary. If they raise expectations beyond their capabilities in this field, they will undermine their reputation and lose support for their independence, which is, in the end, indispensable for maintaining price stability. Besides analytical problems, the ECB justifies its self-declared role in this field with the argument that climate change can have implications for price stability. However, does this imply the ECB, assuming inflation is a target, would argue against significant increases in prices, which are triggered, let's say, by increases in the CO price, by decisions by parliaments, this might raise extreme conflicts between monetary policy and governments. Next slide, please. Let me conclude, not least due to their success during the Great Moderation and in helping to prevent the depression after the collapse of financial markets in 2007-8, central banks were already exposed to elevated expectations. What followed was an overburdening with additional competences in micro and macro potential supervision. In the meantime, central banks have assumed additional new responsibilities by themselves. However, central banks are not almighty. Central bankers should instead show a sense of humility. They must clarify and announce what monetary policy can achieve, and even more importantly, what it cannot deliver. Merely de facto accepting excessive expectations or even contributing themselves to this development implies a major threat to their reputation, because disappointment over failures to meet these expectations must follow. Even when central banks are successful in affecting issues that are not within their mandate, polities over time will not accept that an independent central bank extends its actions into the domain that must be reserved for politicians who are accountable to Parliament and ultimately to their voters. The spread of central bank independence was based on the idea of a clear and limited mandate. To turn the argument around, who could convincingly argue that independence should be given to a central bank that invades deeply into a sphere that must be reserved for the democratic process? Unelected power, the title of the book already mentioned by Paul Tucker. Unelected power must be limited and continuously justified by appropriate policy. So, as you see from my arguments, I'm afraid that we have seen the peak of central bank independence in the world, and the heyday of central bank independence might be behind us. It will take rather long political process to change the legal status, and resistance against that might be brought in parliaments. But central banks must be supported by the conviction of the people. I'm, as you might imagine, not only as a German, but a person who had first done research in this field, and later for 8 years had been the chief economist and member of the Zentralbankrat of the Deutsche Bundesbank. I'm very impressed, so to say, by an example of the Deutsche Bundesbank. And just to show the importance of independence of Bundesbank in the past, there's a famous saying by Jacques Delors, former president of the European Community. He once said, "Not all Germans believe in God, but all believe in the Deutsche Bundesbank." This was partly a joking, but partly also expressing respect for the reputation that German Bundesbank had gained in the course of a relatively short period of time. On the other hand, you might not be aware that independence for the central banks was, so to say, imposed by the Allies, exactly the United States, in 1948 on the statute of the Bankdeutscher Länder, This was before the German Republic was constituted in 1949, and this was taken over in the Bundesbank law of 1957 against the strong resistance of Chancellor Adenauer. He did not like at all, probably as all powerful politicians, to have an independent central bank. And I conclude with a statement by Helmut Kohl. Then he was Chancellor, and the then President of the Bundesbank, Hans Tietmeyer, celebrated his 65th birthday. He came from Bonn to Frankfurt, and he made a remark which in a nutshell enshrines what I think is the essence of the issue. It's also reflected in the statement by Gordon Brown. To quote Kohl, he said, as a politician and especially as a chancellor, I have no sympathy for an independent central bank. But as a citizen of Germany, I'm happy that the central bank is independent. So let me conclude here to have time for your questions. Thank you for attention. I'm looking forward to your certainly interesting questions.
Thank you very, very much, Professor. That interesting talk. Ariana, perfect. So moving on to the Q&A. Would anybody be interested in asking a question live? If so, you can just raise your hand and then I can call on you and allow you to talk. Give it a couple of seconds.
Find the issue boring or?
No, not at all.
So convinced by the remarks, so, but I could ask a number of questions.
I know that I have a couple of questions for you, and I see that in the Q&A and then in the chat, we've had a couple of submissions. So I don't think anybody would be interested in speaking live. We'll move on to the ones asked in the chat. Then if at any point any one of the attendees wants to ask a question live, then just raise your hand and I'll call on you. We'll start with Olaf's question. So thank you for submitting a question, Olaf. Two Fed Reserve presidents recently resigned over criticism of their investment activities and their links to the Fed's asset buying programs. How do you resolve conflicts of interest within central bank workers, given that many will come from a background in finance and will hold many assets that will be influenced by the central bank's policies? And what was the ECB policy in your time regarding your investment activities?
I think for me, it's unthinkable that central bankers take active investment decisions of what kind soever. This might be done in total innocence, but Julius Caesar once divorced from his wife because he said even a shadow of a suspicion must not fall on Caesar's wife. So the same is true for central bankers, especially in their independent position. People will ask, did they have inside information, and how can you reject this suspicion? So there should be clear rules, and to give an example, for example, Jens Weidmann, by the way, when we joined, the 6 of us board members joined the ECB, we had to make a statement, write a statement on our financial position and inform the person supervising this behavior on the actions which were not done anyway. Jens Weidmann, at the beginning, I think, of his term, the first term, was asked about his investment decisions, and he made clear he has just 2 ETF funds, one German and one international. and that's it. So totally passive investment position. I think no central banker should go beyond that.
That makes sense, of course. Moving on to Christina's question. She asks, with respect to the expected rates hike by the Bank of England, possibly by the end of the week, do you think that'll be sufficient to stop inflation from rising?
You can imagine that even I'm the end of my central banker life ended in 2006 when my 8 years term ended at the ECB. I would never criticize or comment what the Bank of England should do. But this is a general issue. Do we see a return of inflation? Central banks were quick to explain that this strong increase in prices is transitory, it's temporary. But this assessment has come into question. It's certainly that temporary factors matter a lot. For example, in Europe, especially in Germany, in 2020, the value-added tax was reduced by 3 percentage points, and at the beginning of this year, 2021, it was raised to its previous level, so by 3 percentage points. This had an immediate effect on prices, and because of the great weight of Germany in the basket of the harmonized index of consumer prices, this had also an influence on European price developments. European, I should say, euro area price developments. We have seen also a sudden rise in energy prices. We have strong base effects due to the fact that in 2020, because of the pandemic, we had very low inflation in almost all countries. And on the basis of this, every increase in 2021 shows a strong base effect. These factors will phase out at the beginning of next year. So we should expect rather substantial decline in the inflation rates, which might be elevated in Germany up to 5%, in the euro area 4%. This is the highest level ever in the euro area since the start of the euro. So this headline rate will substantially decline. But this does not indicate that the inflationary trend will not continue. Charles Goodhart, former chief economist and member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, and Pradhan have published a book demonstrating that a new regime is arising. Remember when China and to some extent India joined the full globalization beginning in 1990. This was an impact of an increase of workers of around 1 billion people. This had a downward pressure on wages and on prices, import prices from Asia, depressed price developments, pricing power all over the world. This effect will probably not fully disappear, but decline for 2 reasons. The speed of globalization will decline. Globalization will not end, it will continue. But the speed, I think, will decline for many, many years. The figures for trade, growth of trade were double that of growth of GDP in many countries. But look to China, the one-child policy will have almost dramatic consequences on the labor supply in China, and because of the dimension of the Chinese economy on the world. As I said, globalization, the speed will decline, also due to the fact that Trump has started with that. Protectionism is rising all around the world. These are all effects. And in this context, probably unions will also get stronger. And the pandemic has shown a very new aspect, that we have a number of bottlenecks. By the way, they also contribute to continuation of price increases. And just to add it at this point, climate change and climate policy will lead to continuously rising energy prices. So this trend will remain with us, and will indicate that I think we will see a real turn in the trend of inflation. I'm not predicting hyperinflation, no way. This will not happen. This will not happen. But coming back to the bottlenecks and its impact on the labor market, you are in the UK, you are confronted with a shortage of truck drivers. Only mentioned this sector. This is also true for Europe, not to the same extent. But for example, also in the restaurant business, hotel business, many people were laid off during the pandemic. And it seems that some of them, quite a number of them, have found new jobs, and they seem not to be ready to go back to these unloved jobs with bad working hours, etc. So we might see strong increases of wages in some sectors. And in Germany, the minimum wage will be increased by the new government quite substantially. This will also feed through the whole structure of wages. And these are all factors which might start in some sectors. And from there we see, I am convinced, strong wage increases. You must pay truck drivers better, otherwise this problem cannot be solved. The same is true for restaurants, so prices will rise, and this will spread also into other sectors of the economy. But this was now a long lecture. I'm waiting for the next question.
Before I move on to other people, I'll take advantage of my position as host to ask my own question. So I don't know if you saw, but recently Jeremy Rood, who was a well-respected Fed researcher, made headlines in a paper declaring that the idea of inflation expectation rested on an extremely shaky foundation, and that obsessing over these was actually useless and dangerous. So he seemed to insinuate a bit of a reverse causality problem, where it wasn't that low expectations were leading to low inflation, but rather low inflation leading to low expectations, and that researchers were getting that reverse causality wrong. So what do you make of this, and how important were inflation expectations in your modeling as a chief economist at the central bank?
Inflation expectations from the beginning played a major role. When I was at the ECB, we had a number of models. We had panels to learn about expectations of companies, etc. We have looked into financial market indicators, etc. So inflation expectations matter. Michael Woodford has said expectations are key, more important than actions. I would not go so far, but inflation expectations certainly matter. And central banks don't stop saying inflation expectations are anchored firmly at our target of 2%. This might turn out to be illusionary. We are now looking back to, let's say, 20, 25 years of low inflation in the whole world. So inflation has more or less disappeared from the radar screen. And many young analysts have never seen relevant inflation in their lifetime. In such an environment, inflation expectations are probably mainly backward looking. This might continue for a while, but there's a high risk that when inflation now raises to unknown levels, and last longer than central banks have indicated, then we might see an abrupt change in inflation expectations at the anchoring of inflation expectations. The New York Fed, for example, has recently published analysis according to which inflation expectations in the US for a time horizon of 1 to 3 years have risen to 4%. This is a substantial, probably an alarming increase in inflation expectations. So I've talked about a new regime of inflation. I think this could be a strong element of this new regime.
Professor Nasehi, would you like to say something?
To just reiterate point, Dr. Issing, I was teaching about inflation. I remember 3 years ago, I was teaching about inflation, and there was a class of 200 people. And I asked my students who have experienced an inflation rate of 5% in their lifetime. And only 2 students out of 100 raised their hand. So this is the very first time happening in the lifetime of our students, the return of inflation. Carry on, Ben.
This is an interesting aspect. As you mentioned in your introduction, I have published a book, Introduction in Monetary Theory. And as you would expect, I had roughly 150 pages on the inflation theory. The first edition was published in 1970. And I had roughly 150 pages on inflation and 4 pages on deflation. And from edition to edition, final edition was the 15th, I considered to take out this chapter on deflation because it was just an historic reminder. Since 1945, prices knew only one direction, upwards. The question was only about the speed of inflation. So I kept this short piece on deflation just to remind students that such a thing as deflation once existed. It's so to say the opposite of your question. Of course, later when development in Japan were obvious, I have extended this chapter on deflation. But your question and especially the reaction of the students, probably they came from Zimbabwe, and then they have seen really hyperinflation. But around the world, this is, if you would ask young people in Germany, who is the chancellor, probably in 5 years he will still say Angela Merkel, because they are just used to that. But we see a regime shift in politics in Germany, and I would be interested if you make this new experiment, how people will react to a new question on inflation.
Thank you. So we'll take 2 more questions. I'll ask another one by Olaf, which is quite interesting. And it's, how do you view the issuance and adoption of central bank digital currencies advancing in the foreseeable future?
Central banks have decided, President Lagarde has made a strong statement that the ECB should be among the first to introduce central bank digital money. I'm not so sure. I think the assessment of such a change is very difficult to take because it depends fundamentally on the design of central bank digital money. How it will be conducted, will there be limits, will there be interest rates, what will happen to prevent, what is taken to prevent a bank run on central bank money, because there's a high risk that in the moment in which people are uncertain about the stability of the financial system, if they would see a bank run, and people would put all their money on accounts of the central bank. So this possibility must be prevented. So the assessment depends a lot on how this regime is, on the design of the issuance of central bank digital money. I've seen only a few critical contributions. Waller from the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, for example, published a short article saying, what is the advantage of digital central bank money? Just that central banks are progressive, are able to be as innovative as financial markets. We have a safe asset. This is banknotes. This is banknotes. Of course, they are unhandy, but in the end, there are a resort of a last resort in case of any financial risky situation. I think there's a widespread suspicion, not least in Germany, that the introduction of digital central bank money will be forced to finally abolish cash, which would enable central banks to drive central bank interest rates deep into negative territory. Central banks deny this, but the suspicion remains.
We'll ask one more question by Ansh, and you had mentioned a part of this as well before. He says that Jens Weidenmann, the Bundesbank president, has recently announced his unexpected resignation, hinting at frustration over the ECB's bond buying program. He asks what the task for the next Bundesbank president will be, especially given that Germany's inflation is now 5% above the Eurozone average.
First, Jens Weidenmann, I know him since 30 years. We are good friends. So he's not a person to step down with a big aplomb. He has not made public declaration, but he has sent a letter to all of the staff of the Bundesbank, which was published on the website. And in this letter, if you read it carefully, you see that he sees a big problem, that the ECB is continuing with its multi-policy course. Imagine the European Central Bank is still in crisis mode with negative interest rates, with high purchases of assets. It's continuing with the pandemic program at a time, and the pandemic is not really anymore creating recession. Growth is back, is interrupted somewhat because of bottlenecks, but the situation does not justify anymore a crisis mode multi-policy. and he has tried to warn. He has warned against risks implied in this approach, because if you delay the exit from such a policy, if you delay the exit, there might come the need to abrupt change and massive reduction of purchasing of bonds and probably raising interest rates. So getting out of this situation timely and in a very smooth manner, this was his message and his warning. And as it is obvious, for years he was not successful. So he saw no chance to participate in a policy in which those warnings are not taken serious.
Thank you, Professor. I think we'll end it at that. Very sorry for those who had unanswered questions. Unfortunately, we have a schedule to stick by. But a big thank you from the Economist Society and from the UCL Department of Economics to Professor Issing for taking your time out of your schedule to come talk to us. We really enjoyed the event. A big thank you to Professor Nasehi as well for being here with us. And finally, thank you to all the attendees for being a great audience and for all the questions. We have many more events coming up in this week. As all of you know, tomorrow we're hosting Professor Gregory Mankiw at 5 p.m. on macroeconomic policy in a time of low interest rates. We hope to see you there. For more information, you can follow us on our social media pages, and we hope to see you all there. Thank you very much to everyone.
Ben, screenshot?
Yes, I'll take another screenshot. There. Thank you very much to everyone. I'll end the meeting now. See you. Thank you, Professor Issing, again.
The best for all of you.
Bye.
Thank you.